Welcome to Airway Exchange, the podcast for empowering educators and inspiring future CRNAs, a new series of Beyond the Mask supported by AANA.
We're your host team. I'm Greg Collins.
I'm Nickie Damico.
I'm Erin Martin. And I'm Louisa Martin. We're here to support the community of CRNA educators with conversations to explore, learn, and grow.
To pursue excellence in the evolving field of nurse anesthesia education.
And to champion our students and enrich the future of the profession.
This is Airway Exchange. Welcome back to Airway Exchange. This is one of your hosts, Nickie Damico, and in this episode, I'm joined by my co-hosts, Erin Martin and Greg Collins. In the month of November, our theme has been the state of the nurse anesthesia education academic workforce. In our last episode, we were joined by Dr. Terry Durbin of the AANA Faculty Stabilization Task Force talking about recruitment and retention of nurse anesthesia faculty. And tonight we're going to be talking about the transition from clinician to the full-time educator role and mentorship of new faculty.
And tonight, much like our last episode, we have a guest that we're very thankful and very happy to have on. We have on Dr. Becky Motykiewicz. Becky is a practicing CRNA, has been for over 10 years, with a primary focus in pediatric and pediatric cardiac anesthesia. She's worked at multiple pediatric hospitals across the United States, bringing specialized expertise in the perioperative care of children with complex congenital heart disease. A graduate of University of Alabama at Birmingham, Becky earned her Master of Science in Nurse Anesthesia before completing her Doctor of Nurse Anesthesia practice at Missouri State University. Her doctoral research focused on the pediatric airway management and education for CRNAs, reflecting her commitment to advancing safety and knowledge in pediatric anesthesia. Becky has served as adjunct faculty at Fairfield University, Thomas Jefferson University, and Texas Wesleyan University. She is, of course, an active member of the American Association of Nurse Anesthesiology, as well as state nursing anesthesia organizations. She's presented at multiple state meetings, at the ANA Congress, and on the Atomic Anesthesia podcast, sharing her expertise with colleagues nationwide. We are happy to have her here tonight. Welcome, Becky. We look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thanks for being here, Becky. I'm so excited to get to talk with you a little bit about your transition to academia. But I'd like to start with a little bit about your background. Just tell us what drew you first to pediatric anesthesia and how did that specialty shape your identity as a clinician and presumably a clinical educator?
I was a PICU nurse before anesthesia school, so that was part of the transition. However, in nursing school, I never thought I would do pediatrics. It's like the one thing I said I wouldn't do. But I fell in love with the pediatric hospital and just taking care of the small, innocent patients. And then when I transitioned to anesthesia role, I really enjoyed that pediatric anesthesia focuses so much more on detail, even more detail than we need to be as CRNAs. And I really like the math aspect of it, that I get to calculate all day, every day, my little drug dosages. So that's what really brought me into pediatric anesthesia.
You're now almost just over 10 years out of school. When did you first start to feel that pull towards full-time academia, and what really prompted you to finally make that leap?
Pretty much every hospital I've worked at has been an academic teaching facility for clinical practice. And I really enjoyed that aspect of teaching in the OR. But I always wanted to add too much more detail to it than I could do in a day in the OR. And so I really started feeling drawn to teaching more. And that brought me into guest lecturing and adjunct roles. And my last adjunct role in Austin, Texas, I was with Fairfield University, is really when I just fell in love with working with the students, getting to know them better, seeing them grow in just one semester from not being able to intubate to fully being able to intubate. And it just made me realize that it was time to transition to that full-time faculty role.
Do you remember like a specific moment, like a spark, a person, or any specific trigger, or did it just sort of gradually come to you?
It was kind of a gradual transition, but I met a student that she was a former CICU nurse at Dell Children's, and just seeing her grow in 1 or 2 semesters from, that wide eye, what am I doing in anesthesia school, to that first day of clinical where she felt confident knowing what to do going into clinicals. And I was fortunate that I got to see that transition in the clinical side because I worked at the same site that she went to. So I got to see both sides of it, and that was really exciting.
We've talked a little bit in our introductory episode. Each of us as now full-time educators talked a little bit about what did it for us. I don't know if any of my co-hosts want to pipe in here, but for me, it was a little bit gradual. And then there was like a moment where I was like, okay, wait, this is what I'm most energized by. Okay, I need to make that transition. So I think it is different for everybody. I don't know if either of you guys had a specific moment or not. For me, it was, kind of a sudden realization of what had been screaming at me the entire time. Like, okay, wait a second, this has been calling your name and now it's time. So if anybody else wants to weigh in on that point.
Yeah, I think for me, it wasn't necessarily a particular event, but Becky, I really resonate with your idea of what you said about feeling like you just wanted to talk more. You didn't have quite enough time in that little OR interaction and being able to dive a little deeper. And so I think that resonates with me. Like, oh, it'd be fun to, be able to do like a whole lecture or maybe, a few lectures or see people where you really have that time outside of just the clinical interaction. So I can relate to that. And I think that is a really powerful moment in your career when that starts to happen.
And very similar on my part, too. I think that I realized in dealing with clinical residents in the clinical setting how big of a challenge it was to have a resident. And then, much like you mentioned, Becky, having the opportunity to pop in and do a few guest lectures, understood the enormity of that challenge. And I think that my personality type is always seeking out something like that. And when I realized that I could do it full time and that I could afford to do it full time, that was a realization as well. I think that was a pretty important spark that eventually turned into something that obviously we're all very passionate about.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think that really speaks to the fact that we kind of all have that similarity as we think about the shortage that we have, right, in faculty. I think that we as educators and maybe leaders in our education programs must never underestimate the power of the little reach out, right? Of saying to somebody, hey, students really seem to enjoy working with you. Would you ever want to give a lecture? That's something so powerful because I think that a lot of times people don't think, I'm going to make that jump. We think, well, I'm a CRNA, I'm not a teacher, because most of us don't have formal training in that. And so I think that that is something that in these roles as educators, we really can. And I think we'll talk more about mentoring tonight, but just that tap on the shoulder can be so incredibly powerful.
As an educator, you don't realize how much folks that don't do what we do, like I just remember the tap that I got. It was one of our VCU faculty, but to think that this person, this was, Sue Wright, she saw in me that I could be an educator. That was like, phew, like, because I had so much respect for her. She was like, oh, she did everything like so great. I'm like, okay, wait a second. If she thinks I can do that, wow, okay. So then I started to sort of shift my mindset to think, okay, well, maybe she's right. Maybe she sees something that I didn't see in that before. So I do think that the tap is helpful. And I think that generally, particularly a lot of times these are our former students that we're tapping. I mean, I think that's one of the most common ways that, that conversation happens is you have a graduate, someone who you've identified as a potential future educator in your program. They graduate and you're like, you should really think about at some point in the future. And then that tap really it means a lot. I mean, people really gravitate to that. And that can be the seed that later grows into a bigger idea to, okay, let me do this too.
That really fits perfectly. That tap that you're mentioning fits perfectly into this idea of mentorship as well, because I know the person that tapped me became my mentor. And I think that was a very realistic and very natural transition, probably due to that one person. So I think that that's something that we can kind of expand upon.
Yeah, I think finding someone to get you in to the classroom for that first time, to show you how to put together a lecture, because I think a lot of people just get thrown into it like, oh, you do cardiac, come lecture on cardiac. And you're like, where do I begin? And so just having someone ease you into that role.
There's relatively limited evidence in the literature on this, but if you do look, there are a couple of articles or studies. One was a recent publication in 2024, and one of the things they found in a scoping review looking at this transition from clinician to academia was that mentorship was one of the most powerful factors and facilitators to making that transition. So I think that aligns pretty well with what we've all seen. That again, we just talked about the tap. Well, that's the spark. That's what starts to help you see yourself in that potential role. but then actually having somebody like you mentioned, Greg, that, takes the time and invests in you and creates a sustained commitment. So have you found so far, and Becky, you've just made this transition to full-time academia how long ago?
September 1st.
Okay, woo!
Wow.
A
So
few months
brand
in,
new.
so this is still hanging in there, a few months into it. So we just talked about that little bit of a spark. Have you started to identify either formal or informal mentors? Are there people in your institution that are, starting to serve in that role for you? How is that playing into your transition so far?
I have luckily found a huge group of mentors, which partly me seeking out people, but also my coworkers helping me, my program director and assistant director have been so extremely supportive. They were those faculty members sort of thrown into teaching, and they're like, we don't want to do that to you. We want you to succeed. We want you to ease into this. And so both of them, Susie and Jess, have been very, very supportive of just making sure I'm not overwhelmed. And then I worked with another colleague when I was adjuncting at Jefferson, Cassie Pendergrass, and she's kind of a newer faculty member, probably 2 or 3 years. And so she has been really guiding me on sort of the new faculty aspect, taking that I'm newer at this look at it. And so the three of them have been really just monumental in keeping me positive, showing me what to do and what not to do.
Yeah, sounds somewhat informal, like not a structured,
Right.
kind of program like that. I think, that was really my experience as well. There was not a formal mentorship program, but there were a lot of colleagues, and I used them in different ways. There were some that I would go to and felt that I could really depend on for advice and guidance on certain aspects of the job. There was not one person that I felt like was my go-to person for everything. So it was kind of, building your C-suite and kind of coming up with this whole team to advise you and, put together all of the different pieces and parts. There has been some discussion though, and maybe you guys talked about this on the last episode, Greg, about creating more structured and formal mentorship for new faculty. And I know there are some programs out there. Has anybody here had experience with those kind of formal mentorship programs or have thoughts on would that be an effective model for us in nurse anesthesia education?
While I haven't personally had experience with a formal program, Terry, in the last episode, Dr. Durbin did kind of tease the idea that part of the faculty stabilization task force and what is now transitioned into the working group, they're looking for standards and they're looking for ways to do that. So I think that that's obviously something that if we don't have in place that we need to start looking for.
I think the AANA is doing some really good things. The early educator workshop that they're having, like the day before Edge, we've had some new faculty in our program. And I think we have 4 of our faculty are going to attend that early educator workshop. And I think, man, what I wouldn't have given for that. Sometimes just to hear it from somebody else's voice versus the people that you're with all the time, I think makes that information relevant in a different way. I think the micro-credential, educator micro-credential is wonderful. I did that this spring. And well, Nickie, I think you provide some of those lectures, don't you?
I did, yes.
Yes, exactly,
Yes.
exactly. So I appreciated that very much. Even as somebody who's been in this for a little bit, I think that that's a wonderful offering by the AANA.
Becky, is that a resource that you've taken advantage of?
I've taken some of the free courses for education, and I am definitely signed up for the early educator workshop because I have heard amazing things about it from people that have taken it before. I don't know if it was just offered for the first time last year, but
It was.
I heard it was just absolutely amazing for new faculty. So I'm definitely going to that this year. And yes, I'd love to do that micro credentialing course.
Becky, what else have you done kind of prepare for the transition, or what else did you do to get your life in order, if you will, or your career in order to make this big jump?
Definitely just trying to get organized has been one of my goals, and sort of reading up on different ways to stay organized, because going from a clinical role, clock in, clock out, you do the case that's presented to you, to, okay, here are 10 things you need to do in the next week. How to prioritize, how to organize, how to not get off track. My husband's an has an office job that he's worked from home for a while, and he's just, like, laughing at me. He's like, "Oh, you have an office job now. It's different, isn't it?" I was like, "Yes, it's very different." So, I've been working to organize, that's a big thing. I have read Make It Stick. I feel like it's not a new book, but it's a new book that everyone has been really recommending on just ways to teach better. And then through Drexel University, where I am, it was offered to join this certificate for college teaching course. So I joined that group, and it's over 2 semesters, and it's just kind of easing you into college teaching. So trying to do those little things to help guide me to be a better teacher. And then seeking advice from people, reaching out to everyone that I know that teaches and just saying, "What do you do? What do you advise?" I feel like you guys will love this. I randomly met Dr. Reed Halterman. He's at Augusta University at annual Congress, and I was like, "Oh, I'm transitioning to faculty. Any advice?" And he's like, "My ultimate advice is I always tell my students, the book, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie." He's like, "I start out every class with that book, and I tell them, like, I'm sorry, I cannot, give you all a cookie. If I give one of you a cookie, I have to give all of you a cookie. So if you come to me and ask something random and I say, no, that's a cookie, this is what I'm talking about." And I have really embraced that with my students where I'm like, I will listen to everything you say, but sometimes that might be a cookie and I cannot give you a cookie.
I like that. I like that. I think that speaks to boundaries, which I think as we talk about faculty, our own faculty wellness, I think boundaries is a huge piece of that. So I like that.
And it is
Yeah.
absolutely true. If you give them a cookie, they want another cookie and a glass of milk and a bedtime story and all that.
I have his voice in the back of my head anytime a student asks for something. I'm like, is that giving a mouse a cookie or
Fantastic. I do think it's great. You mentioned some resources from university, and I think that that's something that if you're in a school nurse anesthesia that is associated with a big university, those resources are there. They're free for the most part. They're usually pretty easy to take care of, and they may be required, depending on what your teaching specialty is or what sort of promotion track you're on. So definitely something to consider there.
It's a whole new culture. It's a whole new language. And, there's so many basic things like what is a credit hour and what are how do we convert contact hours to credit hours? And, all of this language that, I'm curious, did you have in your doctoral program, Becky, any instruction on pedagogy and how to teach, curriculum and instruction? I mean, we had it in my PhD program. I didn't do a practice doctorate, so it was definitely not in my master's well, I take that back. We did have a course, but I mean, I was getting up at the podium and teaching about snowboarding. It was nothing that was really it was relatively unstructured. I wouldn't say that alone would have gotten me there. So, once I started my PhD program, I had some, but still the nuts and bolts and this whole big bucket of information that you need to know about the basics. I mean, it's just, the traditional academic world is so foreign to us as clinicians turned educators. Did you have that in your program? And if not, is that something that Drexel is providing for you or your institution, or is, that's some of the information that you're seeking out from others?
I got 0 training on any of that in either of my programs, and I think that's where we're really lacking is we are not taught to teach, but then we need teachers, and so it's a huge miss in anesthesia programs, and so I think that's something, now that I'm saying it out loud, that maybe adding to my professional aspects class that I'm teaching this semester needs to be thrown in there is if anyone's interested in teaching or just so they understand the academic world as well as students, because I didn't know what my teachers were going through and dealing with. Just the layout of a syllabus and what has to be in a syllabus. If you put it in the syllabus, you have to do it. The term pedagogy, I had to look up because I was like, I don't know what this means, and people keep saying this word at me. So just terminology in academia is so different. And as an outsider coming in, you're just like, what is happening? What is anyone saying to me right now?
What I'm hearing you say is imposter phenomenon. I think we talk about it a
So
lot.
much.
It's a very hot topic right now with our students, right? Oh, we understand. But man, I have never felt like more of an imposter. Truly, that when are they going to figure out that I don't know that I should be here? It's a real thing. So I think imposter phenomenon among faculty is probably a topic of its own.
Especially because you come in and most people have been teaching for a few years, so they've learned these terms, and you're like, "I don't wanna ask what this word means, but I have no idea."
I think that brings up something that again came up in the article in the ANA Journal that I read, but was such a huge thing for me, this role and identity shift. I was previously feeling reasonably comfortable with a, broad set, sort of a depth of clinical knowledge. I felt reasonably good at what I was doing. So I felt like I developed this, 10, almost 11 years of clinical expertise and felt like I kind of knew what I was doing. And then I shifted over into faculty, and I'll never forget, like, the first couple of weeks I'm sitting in my office, and I mean, just almost tearful, like, what was I thinking? I have no idea what I'm doing here. Like, I mean, complete imposter syndrome, but also then this sort of grief and loss of I had a good thing going over there. It was actually going pretty good. And then I've just suddenly did so. It was that sort of identity shift, and I needed to kind of make that transition, that role transition into, now I'm an educator, and unfortunately I'm a really bad one right now is what I felt like. I'm like, I suck at this and I don't know what I'm doing here, and sort of loss of this, sense of comfort and level of expertise. And then shifting back, I think we hear our residents talk about it sometimes, where they go from the experienced ICU nurse and then they transition back into the precepted, the student role, and they struggle with that role transition. I struggled mightily with that when I first moved over. And I'm just curious, you're a few months into that. Have you experienced that? Did anyone else experience that? I mean, I just remember sitting there going, I don't know what I was thinking. I'm so bad at this. And I left something I was feeling good at. What in the world?
I just gave my pediatric lecture, which is, like, my bread and butter, what I do every day, and afterwards, I was like, "That wasn't great." Like, I wanna redo. I just felt like I got up there and got so nervous talking to these students, and I didn't tell them all the things that I felt like I needed to tell them, and so it definitely felt like, "Why am I here? What am I doing? I know this."
I think we have a tendency to be hypercritical, though, because of ourselves, because of our clinical practice. If we don't get something right in our clinical practice, there are dire consequences. And I think we transition into academia, we carry along that self-critical piece of this, but understand we get redos in academics, right? You get to give that pediatric lecture again next year, and you're going to do a lot better. So I think we get those redos. And also we have the opportunity to, it's not a do it now or there's consequences type scenario. We get to spend time and invest time with our residents. And that was difficult for me to understand that. Once I understood that, boy, that took some pressure off. Once I understood the fact that, man, I may not have gotten everything I needed to do, or I may not have said that in the absolute correct way, or that test question wasn't the best worded question. You get the opportunity. It's not a do or die scenario like it is sometimes in the clinical setting, where we get the opportunity to kind of make things right. We get the opportunity to learn from our mistakes. And I feel that being honest with ourselves and being honest with our students and our residents about that is hugely important. And really, I think learning from those, as obviously you have, makes us better as we go along.
I was just about to say something very similar. I think our students actually love it when they see us being a little bit vulnerable. When we can say, "Oh, that was a really bad test question. We're going to throw that one out." I just think it humanizes us to them. And so as much as it feels like, "Oh, that wasn't great," I think it actually makes us better. We tell our students this, right, in the clinical area. "Oh, the best lessons you learn is when you make that med error," or whatever it is, right? So I think the best lessons that we can learn as educators too is maybe when something kind of tanks a little bit and we're like, "Oof, that didn't land the way I thought it would," and acknowledge that, right, with the students. And I think it does. It humanizes us. And I think it lets them know that, oh, okay, we're all in this together.
So you've made the jump relatively recently. What has been the biggest surprise so far? Like, what did you not anticipate when you were thinking about making this jump that you've since figured out?
Things I did not realize is how much I would be sitting in front of my computer all day and the time it takes to do any activity, either putting together a lecture, grading a test, making test questions might be the unanticipated hardest part. Just the time it takes every day to do certain tasks has really been a surprise to me.
Yeah, it's way, way more than most things. Like, oh, what they do is so easy. I mean, how hard can it be to put together a lecture? Really, really hard. And then, yeah, to make a test question that is robust and can withstand, the gauntlet that these test questions go through, once they're out there for our students. Yeah, it is much harder than it looks.
What have you found to be the most rewarding part thus far, Becky? We've talked a lot about, what's hard but since September 1st, so we're a couple months in, what's been like this is why I want to continue to do this?
100% the students, just interacting with the students every day, getting to know them, seeing their growth, their challenges, what they're going through, and trying to continue to encourage them and remind them that, this is temporary. And just seeing that relaxation come over them because in the moment they are so stressed. And so to be able to just give them a couple of words of advice and see them take the anxiety down a notch has been amazing.
The good moments do tend to, over time, outweigh the bad ones. You probably haven't yet been through the first round of evaluations, right?
I have not. I'm scared.
Okay, yes. We've hinted a little bit at that in this podcast before, but to give you a little bit of advice on that, and I'll let the others here give you some advice on that too. Just don't let it get you down. It's a really hard thing, and I think generally the first couple of times you go through that, course evaluation process, it just feels really it feels rough. And, I think there's just look through all of the information that you're given there, recognize, there's going to be some nuggets of things that will be helpful for you. There's going to be a lot of stuff that maybe you can just put aside and go, okay, and then just remember those good moments, the moment when you had the light bulb come on in the classroom or, you did explain something really great. Just hold on to those things and remember that over time it's more good than bad. But yeah, I'll let others weigh in here on the evaluations. That was my biggest surprise transitioning over is how emotional that process was. It was really hard, I thought.
I think one of the best pieces of advice that I was ever given by a much more experienced educator that I was fortunate enough to get to team teach with is that one student providing a piece of feedback doesn't mean you need to make a change. And that is really hard. So you get your course evals and one person says, I didn't like that assignment. And so the gut is like, okay, we have to change that. And if 4 or 5 students say that, yeah, maybe think about that. But it's so easy to be very knee-jerk because you just want to do it right? You just want this to be perfect. And so, we better get rid of that. We better change that. We better change that. That is a hard thing for me. It was hard not to respond to every single one of those things. But really great advice was, you can just kind of, one person doesn't mean you have to change the whole course. That was impactful for me.
I completely agree. And I think that more than anything else, after we get our evaluations every semester, our program director wants us to do a little self-reflection and write that self-reflection up and then submit it to her. I think that's her kind of way of keeping up with it. But that self-reflection is a great opportunity for me to look at everything big picture versus looking at one individual comment, whether it be good or bad. Another thing that one of my mentors always told me that if you pay attention and believe the good statements, then you must also pay attention and believe the poor statements. The honesty in the good is no less honest than the bad. So boy, that self-reflection does really help me kind of turn that around. I look for comments in those that are very specific, good or bad. That very specific comment tells me that that person really had something on their mind, that student did, and they spent the time to relay this information to me. And so usually that's the ones that are generic about my personality, about my classroom style, about my bad jokes. I kind of let those slide. It's the ones that really, say in this particular lesson on this particular page, this could have been better. That's the ones I pay attention to.
I don't know how anyone could think your jokes are bad, Greg. Come on.
Oh, just wait. Just wait till you get to know me better, Nickie. My dad jokes will come out eventually, I assure you.
That speaks to some of the emotional toll that, some of this can take on you. It is sometimes harder. I think, in the clinical arena, we get used to the humble pie that we know is a part of that job. I think it's easy to think that the educator role doesn't have quite so much humble pie. I actually think it has more. I think that's one of the myths about making that transition. You're like, oh, no, no, no. It's much more humbling to be in the clinical arena. No, you're getting it from all, perspectives on this end. I'd love to talk a little bit about, and you mentioned sitting in a chair. For me, that's one of the hardest challenges of being in academia is dealing with the lifestyle of it, because so much of it requires doing exactly what we're doing here, sitting at a computer, sitting in a desk. It makes it incredibly difficult to stay healthy. What are your thoughts on the work-life balance? How have you managed that so far? How do you anticipate navigating that challenge?
So, for all the time organization, I've been trying to dabble with different things like project management tools. And really, I have found just like a checklist written down has been my go to. And every day I put exercise on there. And so it just reminds me like I need to check that box off to get out of this chair and go exercise. I also try to set a timer when I'm especially deep into putting together a lecture, so I don't just sit for 2 hours. I get up every 30 minutes, 45 minutes, whatever, to just not be stuck in this chair all day. Because I am in the OR, I was a stander and I would just walk around the room. I never sat that much, and so to sit all day has been really hard. I also am fortunate that I live in the city, and so I have been walking to and from work. It's about a mile and a half to my office, so I get a little exercise then. And having a dog is always a great motivator to get up because at like 3:30 in the afternoon, she's like, "Nope, time to walk away from the computer, time to take me for a walk."
Any other advice from our more experienced educators on how to keep that work-life balance?
I'm not very good at it. So I honestly don't think I've got nothing because that is probably my biggest challenge is finding that balance. And so I'm always anxious to hear what other people have to say because that's my area of work.
I really appreciate my early mornings and the ability to get up and exercise. That's not something I could do when I work clinically because I was getting up so early. I would have to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning if I wanted to do anything before, I got to the hospital. I think that the ability to kind of manage my schedule somewhat and adapt my lifestyle to my schedule has been helpful. I find opportunities wherever I can, usually on Mondays at noon, if I'm able to. I walk across campus and play tennis for an hour and a half with some colleagues. And so, that being a resource at the university that I wouldn't have had in clinical practice is an advantage of an academic role. But those early mornings to me are mine now. And I'm not in a hurry to get to the hospital most of the time. And I'm able to not only get up and exercise, but also just to kind of have some personal time to free my mind and get prepared for the day or the week.
I think that's something to also mention and encourage with people transitioning to faculty, or as we're trying to encourage more people to transition to faculty, is there are times when, yes, you are tied to your phone, computer, your students, and there's other times you're not. You're not stuck in the OR for that 10 hours. I, on Friday, had an exam, and then that was all I did on Friday. I graded the test and went home and enjoyed Halloween with my neighborhood. So just having a little more flexibility in my schedule has been a nice change that I wasn't stuck in the OR all day on Halloween. I got to actually dress up and wear a Halloween costume to work.
That's great. And the autonomy of that schedule is impressive. And that's not something that we're used to clinically. We're used to our schedule being very dictated. Having some autonomy and planning your day, I could work. We're obviously, working late tonight, but I could work at any point in the day as long as I get the job done. Obviously, I have to be in a classroom at a certain time, in the sim lab at a certain time. Beyond that, I get to set that schedule. And I think that that's been a lift. And it's impossible to really put a monetary value on that when we talk about comparing this to clinical practice. It's something that in the past, when I've had opportunity to go back into the clinical practice or back into the anesthesia business world, I've always valued that autonomy in my schedule that I have. And that's been a significant reason why I'm still here and why I'll be here, I think.
It's definitely a double-edged sword. I'll never forget early on, I was just struck by how exciting it was that I could hydrate all day and I didn't have to worry about, planning that out so that I had to, like schedule when I'm going to get a pee break to be able to get out of an OR. I was like, I can drink water all day long and I can go to the bathroom and get up and get out whenever I want. So, that's the good. The bad, the good also is that your work can be done on the weekends at night. It does, shift around for the other things. It's not less work. It's not less busy, and you are still tied to your phone, and the phone might ring, especially as you spend longer in academia. You tend to take on other administrative responsibilities and so forth, which means you're going to get those phone calls when something's happening on the weekend. So, it's kind of a mixed bag. I do want to bring up a little bit one of the other, big things that come up a lot in conversations about, and with folks that are trying to think about making this transition, and particularly in this current job market, the disparity in salaries. I don't know if you want to speak to that, Becky, at all in terms of whether that did or didn't impact the timing of your decision to make this shift, and how you've made peace with that, if you will, because in general, there is a compensation difference between academia and clinical practice. That's something that people manage differently. I'd love to give you the opportunity to talk to that because you did make the jump.
I think that's one of the biggest drawbacks and why we are having such a hard time recruiting people. I am an anomaly because fortunately and unfortunately, I've mostly worked in pediatric settings and they don't really pay us that well at the pediatric hospital. So for me, the change was not as dramatic as some of these adult facilities where people are making just astronomical amounts in the clinical setting. So for me, it was a little bit easier. I also have a very supportive partner that we balance things very well. We are very frugal people that don't spend a lot of money. So it was just a great time for us where we knew financially we were in a great place. I think the other side of it too is where I'm working at Drexel, I get a day off every week to work clinically. And so for me, I can make up the difference in the salary by working one day PRN at a facility. I'm working at CHOP in the cardiac anesthesia department again, but I could probably go to some rural area in Pennsylvania and make even more if I wanted to. And so I think just realizing that balance is out there too for people.
Yeah, that's a strategy that I think a lot of our programs have used to ease that decision for a lot of folks. We used to be at VCU a lot more strict about how many clinical hours, and I've been able to make a little bit of headway to give some slack on that to give people a little more time. So I think it's one of the most logical ways that we can do that. I don't know how you guys at other programs have managed that. And again, I think some of it is also framing the rest of the job, that there are also intangibles, like Greg mentioned, that you really can't put a price tag on, but that may be very important to those who are considering the transition. So I'm curious if you guys have any thoughts on that.
We are fortunate. So our program is in a hospital-based program. And so we are completely supported by our Department of Anesthesia, which means that we make clinical wages as educators. And that is, I know, not common. And I will forever be grateful for that. We also are then a little bit beholden sometimes to our department. I have a 0.2 clinical FTE built in. So that can be challenging sometimes. If I'm like, oh, I'm swamped this week, we have this. And well, you got to work clinically, so that is the arrangement that we have where I work. And it's been great. All of our faculty actually have a portion of their FTE that is just dedicated to clinical work in our department, because we are all kind of one. The department funds and supports our program.
That's great. I think that being built in and also the increase in compensation that brings is fantastic. Not having that here, but also having, the ability to make extra money working in the clinical practice is fantastic. I think that the ability now with Becky, as you mentioned, what if you go out and seek a rural place, or what if you seek an opportunity in a place that's going to pay you more per hour or pay you more per day than maybe in your routine practice? I also like the ability that, unlike with Erin, what she just mentioned, if I have a busy week and I can't work clinically that week, or I don't want to work clinically that week because I'm exhausted from what I've done, at the university that week, then I have the ability not to do that. And I think that, again, it's difficult, obviously I'm not going to make that money, but how much better is my life that week because I was able to make that decision. So I think that's great. Becky, I'm going to come back to you. We talked about this idea of supplementing with clinical practice. I think you have a very specialized, it sounds like robust clinical practice. How are you going to kind of keep that up? What's your plan to keep that specialty honed and your ability to practice clinically as you complete this transition into the academic world?
It's definitely going to be a challenge because pediatric cardiac anesthesia is not for the faint of heart, but it's something an area I already worked in. So I sort of know the flow of everything. Currently, I'm doing every other week just to give myself a day to breathe as I'm transitioning. And I think that is another aspect of it is just not diving in head first, trying to take on all the tasks, trying to do all the things, just take it a little slower. And the reason I wanted to go back to CHOP and work in the cardiac anesthesia department was because I like those big cases and I want to keep up with that. I know I could probably make equal money pushing propofol for colonoscopies, but I want to make sure I'm in the OR keeping that clinical knowledge going, especially with my specialty,
Good for you.
at least for now.
I think as educators, one thing that's always been great about nurse anesthesia education versus perhaps nursing education at large is many of our faculty do maintain their clinical practice and do maintain and keep a clinical skill set. And that's really important to us and something that I think is, ubiquitous. We all kind of do that. I continue to practice. I technically could give up that practice, but I just like giving anesthesia and I like having some credibility with our residents. I want to be able to still do the things that I'm teaching them to do. I think it's really important for me to have my hand in it so that I'm able to relate. I mean, I don't want to be so far removed from practice that I can't relate to what our residents are experiencing in the clinical arena. I just kind of want to know what that feels like. So I think as far as advice, I would say definitely keep that for as long as you can, keep that going. It's really important. And I think it's really one of the things that keeps us as educators satisfied over time because most of us go into education because we have such passion for the specialty. And part of that is being able to continue to care for patients in the OR. As long as you can keep it, I would keep it.
Completely agree.
I think that's one of the fears of people transitioning to a faculty role is losing that clinical practice, losing that thing you're so good at to do something new. And so knowing that I can, if I want, practice once a week or pick up weekend shifts if I wanted to, knowing I have that opportunity was important to me. And I think important to a lot of people making that decision, trying to decide if they want to teach full time.
I think that's one of the ways forward for us to, help ease this disparity in salaries between clinical and education, but then also keeping folks able to maintain that is going to be one of the ways forward. The ways that we recruit people into the academic realm is to be able to offer that as a benefit.
Particularly now with salaries like they are, I think that's even a greater advantage now. The disparity between academic salaries and clinical practice salaries, the ability to make up that difference, that real world difference, I think because of the increase in the hourly rate or the daily rate that CRNAs are getting, I think that's even more meaningful now to us in full-time academics that we can make up that difference. And I think that probably a lot of our listeners who are considering this transition may not understand that that's the ability to do that. I make as much with a clinical practice in addition to my academic practices as I would practicing full-time clinically.
I think we're getting close to the end of our time with you today. Becky, as we start to wrap it up here, is there any piece of advice you would give to other CRNAs who are considering a similar transition into full-time academia?
I think take that first step, do a guest lecture, do an adjunct role, get in there and help with sim labs is a great introduction where you can see sort of the behind the curtains of teaching and what we're doing in the universities and the sim lab. That was the big thing that started drawing me in is just slowly getting in there and being able to see what was happening. Like the students aren't as scary as I thought they were going to be. And the lectures are fun to put together and that it's okay to not be perfect. You can perfect it eventually, but you don't have to come out with your first lecture being absolutely perfect. It's probably going to be a disaster, but it's that first step.
Well, as Greg said, you're going to get to continue to give that lecture year after year after year after year. So you're going to get other opportunities to do that. I think that's really great advice. And I think a lot of what you've shared with us tonight, Becky, will resonate with those who have either recently made that transition themselves or are thinking about it. And we hope that more and more great CRNAs who have, the kind of clinical expertise that you clearly have will consider making that transition as well. So again, thank you very much for being with us. We're excited to have gotten the chance to spend this time with you. We're going to be shifting gears a little bit after this episode as we march into December. We're going to shift to a theme of wellness. We'll have an episode on faculty wellness and work-life balance, something we've touched on a little bit today and an all-important part of the faculty experience. And then we'll also be talking about student or resident wellness and some New Year's resolutions as well. So thank you so much for joining us. We hope to see you with our next episode.